Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I'm Vice President for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our weekly update of what is going on in the state capitol, or what bills are moving, and what issues are going to be enacted that will affect everybody in our state. So, as I mentioned before, we're tracking the legislature day by day, week by week, and this is week 10 of a scheduled 105-day session, and it's the 69th legislative day for those of you who are keeping track. The next major deadline for the legislature is March 29th, and that is the cutoff date for bills that have to pass in committee in the opposite house. So House bills have to pass in a Senate committee, Senate bills have to pass in a House committee, and those bills by definition have already passed one full House, either the House or the Senate. The next cutoff date will be passage in the full House in the opposite House. So House bills would have to pass in the Senate, Senate bills have to pass in the House in order to stay alive. As always, there's a caveat with these rules. They're completely internal to the legislature. They do not apply to budget and revenue bills, which are on a different track. They also don't apply to transportation-related bills, which has its own budget process. I'll touch on that a little bit later on. And then there's always the possibility that the Democratic leadership can reach back. They could bring literally any bill back from the dead and roll it into the budget or pass it separately. And we won't know that until mid to late April when it's later in the session. So right now, some of the issues that we've been tracking, and we've seen bills continue to move. A major one that we have done a lot of work on is SB 5054. And this is the bill that would cut class time in public schools by 4 hours. Of course, the sponsors of the bill deny that that's what they're doing. And so our analysis shows that the bill would weaken the definitional meaning in state law of what an instructional hour is. Right now, instructional time in the classroom, which every child has a right to, is defined as direct classroom time with a certified teacher. What this bill does is weaken that standard so that a non-certified staff person can be in the classroom with children while the actual teacher goes off and does other meetings or other training or some other activity. And we think this is shorting kids on class time. So Lee Thinna, who is our energetic education analyst, testified before the House Education Committee last Tuesday on this bill. And no surprise, she presented data showing that less class instruction time hurts kids. It also hurts children, particularly at a time with COVID learning loss, where children have lost anywhere from 6 months to 2 years of instruction, and that test scores show that they're falling behind. One member of the committee, a Republican, Representative Skylar Rood, asked her directly about her research regarding time in class. Lee cited the case of Finland, which has added 10 days to their school year in order to help kids. And then she showed the data that helps children learn. And the chairwoman of the committee, Representative Tomiko Santos, cut Lee off. And this is a quote that Lee gave me. This is posted online as well. She said, "Lee, we don't need to hear any of your research about what's happening in Finland." And so that attitude, which we run into fairly regularly, is don't confuse me with the facts. We're going to run this bill through no matter what. So our research shows that time on task is what children learn from. And this bill is basically robbing children of learning time. And whether you cite other countries or other states or just common sense, we're able to demonstrate that that's true. And of course, we're disappointed by the chairwoman of the committee who said she just didn't want to hear it. And Leave was gavelled down. I mean, her time had expired maybe, but the committee, the head of the committee said they're moving on to something else. So that indicates to us that SB 5054 will almost certainly pass in committee and be sent on to the full House for consideration. Next is a trend that we're seeing in school choice. News from another state, Arkansas, this week became the 5th state to enact universal school choice. So Arkansas joins Arizona, West Virginia, Iowa, and Utah in allowing any family in the state to access the funds that their child is entitled to for education and choose any certified school in the state to send that child to, and that will be supported with public funding. People have asked me about, well, what is the enforcement? Of course, families don't receive direct cash or direct payment. They choose a school which is approved by the state. They enroll the child, file the paperwork, and then the government provides a set amount of funding for that child. Parents can add to that funding if the tuition is higher, but it provides equal access for everyone in the state to the school of the parents' choosing, and it's supported with public money. There's a real trend here because Florida, Texas, and Nebraska, 3 other states, are debating similar bills. And what we try to point out in Washington state is that this is a progressive trend that's happening in other places. And Washington, which always prides itself on being on the cutting edge of education, is actually falling behind as these ideas are picked up in other states. So we'll keep tracking that. The next issue I want to touch on is Pam Lewison on our staff, our agriculture expert, has been asked to give her opinion about the proposal to reintroduce grizzly bears to Washington state. This is in the early stages of this proposal, but this would have an impact certainly on rural areas of our state, also on recreation. Some people are very nervous about this idea. Washington state has plenty of black bears already. They're part of the natural environment. But I did some scientific research here. A black bear weighs roughly 300 pounds. A grizzly bear is more like 900 pounds. So recovering species we think is great, but it needs to be done in a smart way that maintains public safety. I also thought it was interesting that a grizzly bear actually has the Latin word for horrible in its scientific name. So some people who mostly live in cities are gung-ho for this idea. People who live where Pam lives in rural areas are a little more questionable about it. And you just want to make sure that there are safeguards in place. We'll see what happens there. Next issue is Todd on our staff, our environmental expert, has done research on the governor's gas-powered car ban, which is now going to go into effect in 2035. A lawsuit has been filed against the governor because he adopted a policy of subjecting Washington state to California's gas-powered car ban law. And so there's a constitutional issue about whether we in Washington state can be governed by laws that were enacted in another state. So that's a straight common sense constitutional question that is now going to the courts. Regarding the issue itself, Todd points out that even Jay Inslee has not met his own standards on electric vehicle adoption in our state. In 2019, or 2018, I think earlier, Jay Inslee announced that he would like 50% of state-owned vehicles, the ones that are bought by the government, to be electric vehicles. By 2020, that number today is 11%. So Todd points out the hypocrisy that state leaders continually talk about saving the planet, global warming. They set goals and standards even for themselves and then consistently fail to meet those benchmarks. So we think they should be more flexible with the general economy if they're not able to meet their own rules. Next is on the general economic outlook. So there's a lot of news about recent bank failures. I received a report from Wells Fargo looking at the economy, noting that the bank failures are likely to weaken real GDP growth in the future. Their estimate is GDP will contract by 1.2% later this year and earlier going into next year. That is not only because of what's in the recent news, but just the general weakness in the economy. That's of concern to everyone, but particularly for what it means for budget writers in Olympia. So far, the Democrats have been used to just enormous increases in revenue coming in. Every revenue estimate increases by several hundred million beyond what was expected. We expect that trend to flatten out. They are not acting that way in Olympia. They are charging ahead with plans to add a lot to the state budget, as much as $4 or $5 billion over current spending. The next revenue forecast is due on Monday, March 20th. That will be used as the basis for writing a new 2-year budget. And as I mentioned earlier, lawmakers really focus on the budget in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the session in April. They will use this revenue forecast that's coming up to write that budget. But our concern is they won't be careful enough to realize, as Wells Fargo reports, that there's an expectation that the economy is going to contract or at least flatten out. And we think they should take that into account. Last issue I'll touch on is transportation funding. So again, this is delayed until later in the session. The Washington State Department of Transportation had already submitted a budget request earlier this year. They requested $7.5 billion for road projects. Interestingly, the governor cut the request of his own department, and he cut that to $5.4 billion. In addition, he canceled several construction projects that were on the calendar. that were supposed to be funded under two previous funding packages called Connecting Washington and Moving Washington. These are major funding bills that have been enacted by the legislature to do road projects, highway improvements across the state, and Inslee is now cutting back on those. The problem we see from a leadership point of view is that those two spending packages passed by bipartisan votes because there are genuine needs around the state. Whether you're a Republican or Democrat district, people need good roads and safe highways. And lawmakers voted for those packages and actually took tough votes because they include revenue increases in taxes as well. And then here we are a few years later, and the governor is cutting back on them. The governor denies that he is canceling projects. He says that he's simply delaying them. Our point of view is that if the public doesn't benefit from a public service, that's the same as canceling it for the moment. The most famous project, or infamous, I should say, is the North-South Freeway in Spokane, where that community has been waiting literally decades for the state to step up and fund a project in their area. The governor's request with that cut I mentioned is considered to be dead on arrival at the legislature. That's an interesting response, even from Democrats. And that next week, the House and Senate Transportation Committee leaders, working majority and minority, working together, will no doubt issue a transportation spending package of their own, and that will be the real budget that the legislature will debate. We don't know what that dollar figure will be, but we'll be tracking that and see what comes up. Charles Prestrud, who worked in the transportation department for years himself, is our analyst on that issue, and he'll be able to provide an independent point of view about meeting the needs of mobility and transportation in our state. So next is looking forward. We have our on-the-go live Facebook event is on March 21st at noon. That's hosted by David Bose and includes our policy analysts talking about current issues. And then later on in the summer, we have lunch events at Gig Harbor and Bellingham. And as always, we want to say thanks to our supporters across the state. We see a need for an independent voice on public issues now more than ever. We're also very concerned, as I've mentioned in the past, about respecting a variety of opinion, having an open debate, respecting free speech rights. Often that's very constricted, and that is something that we support every single day. And our members across the state and our donors make that possible. And I want to again extend a thank you to everyone for that. With that, I will be back with another update next week. Thanks.